Hello and welcome to our session, Automate Business Processes with Workflow. Our speaker, Scott, is presently a managing partner of PPM Works Incorporated and has been helping client customers with Microsoft-based project and portfolio management solutions for over 15 years. Scott, take it away.
Thank you, Andrew, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone from around the globe. It's my pleasure to have the opportunity here to present at this first virtual Project Virtual conference. And I'll be speaking on a topic of automating business process with project server workflows, one that's near and dear to my heart. So I have to admit, this was the first time I needed to translate UTC time to my current, so it's good that we're now moving towards globalization and being able to have these opportunities to present to everyone. So a little bit about our company. As Andrew mentioned, we have very experienced staff, been working really since the onset of Project and Project Server, Project Central, going back about 15 years. We've had opportunities to present at several Microsoft Project User Group events as recently as last week. We've also spoke at other project conferences in the past, and now we're really privileged to transition this now to the global audience. So what are the goals of this session? I reviewed all the agendas, and it didn't appear to me that there was any other sessions really on details of workflows. So I really want to make sure I gave you a end-to-end overview of everything in Project Server workflows. It's going to be a little bit of a challenge to get it in an hour, but I've kind of trying to take a broad stroke across everything, condense where possible, so we're able to do that. Along the way, I want to point out that if you're just new to workflows, there's going to be information for you. If you're an advanced project workflow developer, there's going to be pieces there for you. And if you have seen me or others present on the topic of workflows, I also wanted to cover what's new. There were two new workflow features that were introduced earlier this summer, bulk updating custom fields and creating project sites from workflow. So again, if you've seen this in the past, there will be some new information for you. So when we look at our agenda, we'll take a little bit of time to introduce everyone to workflows, what are the concepts we're talking about, and then we'll go through our 4-step development methodology. This is planning and designing your workflows, configuring the project web app, building workflows, and lastly, publishing and testing. And notice that really the majority of the time there is going to be spent in the building workflow when we talk about all the details. And we will allow at least 10 minutes, hopefully a little more, 15 minutes at the end. So the format is to hold all questions, but I do encourage you to put them into the Google group chat, and Andrew and I will be going through those questions right near the end of the session. So with that, let's get into introduction on workflows. So maybe your organization has Project Server, Project Online, and you've never implemented workflows. And there's a couple of reasons that I'll give you here to consider them, starting with some simple reasons. Sometimes customers have a very simple requirement, which is to send an email notice upon project completion. Pretty simple request. The project's complete, we want to send an email. Or maybe right when the project kicks off, it could be on the other end, right? Workflows will allow you to do that. You may have no interest in governance and all these advanced features that I'll talk about, but you just want to send an email. That would be a simple reason to do it. Another reason, if you have been involved in more detailed configuration of Project Online, Project Server, you know that you can set required fields. Well, when you set a required field at the system level, that's going to be required for all different departments. Workflows actually give you the opportunity to set required fields by department. So again, even if you weren't interested in all the other stuff that I'm going to explain today, you can actually use workflows to set required fields by department. And we have actually used that for customers just for that reason. Another reason would be to improve performance, particularly some of the new features that were released this summer. Being able to create your project sites or not create project sites in certain points in the life cycle. Maybe you have proposed projects or ideas coming into the system, and there's no real need to create a project site for those ideas until they move along in the life cycle. So that will actually improve the performance by determining when you create your project sites. So those are some simple reasons. Let's look at the advanced reasons. Implementing demand management. That is going to be the strategic selection of which projects move forward, matching your business goals with the projects. So that would be one reason to implement workflows, essentially not allowing projects to proceed until they've been selected through what's called a portfolio analysis. Another advanced reason is to transition from informal to formal portfolio governance. So before, maybe your projects, you know them as either active or completed. We can formalize this, put in stages, put in approval gates, things like that. Much more formal portfolio governance as projects progress from their initiation through close. And then really, workflows raise the organizational commitment to portfolio management. Without workflows, again, projects are just active or closed. With workflows, you have approvals, you have people receiving emails, you have PMO members or directors, executives in the organization that are required to approve projects. So all this raises really your commitment to having portfolio governance and portfolio management in your organization. So now that I've talked about all the reasons to consider workflows, let's look at what components you would need. The first thing you're going to need is understanding of your business process. So I'll talk about whiteboarding, but that's a great option there to really collect what is your business process. Next thing you're going to need is either Project Online or Project Server 2013. Now, although there were workflow capabilities back in Project Server 2010, they were a lot harder to develop. You actually needed to program them in Visual Studio. So what I'll be talking to today is the fact that if you have Project Online or Project Server 2013, you can do that with SharePoint Designer, and that's the last component I have here. So you will need SharePoint Designer 2013. Just one note on SharePoint Designer, you might have read already that there is no SharePoint Designer 2016 planned, but Microsoft has said that 2013 can still be used with Project Server, Project Online, the 2016 version. So they're still going to allow development in SharePoint Designer until they have a new solution for that. And I do recommend that, even though you can use Visual Studio 2013, SharePoint Designer is going to be an easier user interface for you. All right, so let's get down to the specifics. What do you need to enable workflow in your environment? So there's a few setup steps. Great news for you if you're on Project Online. It's ready out of the box. You can get started. If you're not on Project Online, you have Project Server 2013, you're going to want to review this TechNet article I have linked here, and there are two general steps. One is you're going to install and configure a product called Workflow Manager. That's going to go onto your SharePoint platform. And then you're going to configure Workflow Manager to work with your SharePoint Server 2003 farm and specifically activate it on your project web app site. After you've done those steps, the next thing you want to do is validate that the installation is working, and one of the best ways to do that is to launch SharePoint Designer. So let me show you a brief demo of that. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is launch SharePoint Designer here from my desktop. And after you've launched SharePoint Designer 2013, you want to open your project web app site. Mine happens to be a Project Online version. SharePoint Designer will open it up. And here in the left navigation for workflows, you're going to go to the third option down, which is the workflows area of the site. So in this particular site, I've already set up several different workflows, 6 or 7 there. The first time you come here, it will be blank. And to confirm that you've configured correctly, what you're going to do is click here to create under the Workflows ribbon a new site workflow. These are the workflows that are used for the project web app. And of course, you'll give it a name, but really when we talk about confirming, we are validating that this option here to create a new platform workflow with platform type SharePoint 2013 Workflow Project Server is available. If you're on Project Server on 2013 on-prem, you come into SharePoint Designer and you don't see that option, it's likely that you have not configured. Okay, I'm getting some feedback that my voice is a little bit ahead of the webcast, so I'll talk a little slower here. Okay, our next step is going to be going through a process of creating workflows. And this is a 4-step process we're recommending. Planning and designing your workflow, configuring the project web app, building your workflow in SharePoint Designer 2013, and last, publishing and testing that workflow. So our first step in plan and design is to begin with whiteboarding. So we like whiteboarding exercises. And if you know a little bit about workflows, you know that they are fixed in the project web app to have phases, and then within phases, stages. So using that construct, what we'll do with our customers is we'll whiteboard what would be the possible phases at the top, those are the black boxes, and then stages within those. And you can use preferably a standard that you have in place in your organization, or you can go to PMI for their standard phasing. This fix, I do like to let my customers know that we're going to need to work within these phases and stages. Sometimes your phases will just have one stage represented in blue below. And then what I've shown here in red is that we'll have certain notes about each phase and stage. Maybe we have E for email going out, a P for a portfolio analysis, being a selection, and then based on either an acceptance or rejection of approval, you might move to a different stage in your workflow. So generally, you're mapping it out on a whiteboard. We take that whiteboard into Visio, and I want to emphasize that even though there are some design capabilities in Visio to design workflows for Project Server, Project Online, in this case, I'm just showing a design for the purpose of documentation. This is not a live design that we're going to import into our workflow or anything like that. So we like the swim lane diagrams, and we'll go ahead and put our phases on the top. Again, our stages are represented below that. And you can see more detail in this Visio about where projects go when they may be rejected. A little icon represents when there's an email going out. And it's going to help all your stakeholders conceptualize the type of workflow you're designing. Then we'll take the information from the Visio and the whiteboard and put it into an Excel toolkit that we have. And in fact, in the end, I'm going to give you an opportunity to email us to get a copy of this toolkit. The toolkit has several tabs, and the first one that I'm showing here is the phases and stages of workflow. So again, we translate this, we provide a little more detail. Notice a tip that I have here is as you're configuring phases and stages, you want to include a numbering schema. There are views in the application that actually show these phases and stages alphabetically sorted. So it's really a tip and a best practice to include a numbering schema in front of those stages so that they're properly sorted in views. So I've done that. You can see I start with 1.1 for the first phase, and I go to 2.1 for the second on down. Other thing this allows you to do is describe your phases, describe your stages, and what we have here on the right is something called a description for submit. So if users are moving from stage to stage with a submit action, this will be the description that shows right before they submit in the workflow. Okay, the second tab in our workbook is what we call the required fields tab. So here we're going to show which fields are going to be available and which fields are going to be required per stage. So the way this actually gets configured in the product is through what are called project detail pages. And really, to fit all of this content into an hour, I'm not going to have time to go over the detailed configuration in the project web app. So we're kind of just sticking towards workflow topics, but I will show you generally where those are found. The idea is that you're going to, based on information in this worksheet, make project detail pages, or PDPs, available at certain stages in the workflow. And then on those project details, you're going to have fields, and you're able to configure, this is what I mentioned earlier, if a certain field is going to be required, available, or even something I don't have shown, at least on this diagram, is a field becomes read-only. And the tip there with read-only fields is really limit that. We find that if we set too many fields as read-only, users become frustrated because they're not able to update them. And so I've mentioned this concept of project detail pages. The next worksheet here is going to identify by stage which project detail pages appear. And if you're talking about a special one called strategic impact, that's one that has business drivers on it, you can decide if that project detail page is going to be required or not. Okay, and our fourth and final worksheet in the toolkit is a very detailed one on workflow actions. So we like to put everything on paper before we get into configuration. And what this is going to do is allow you to go through your stages and define what happens at each step. When workflows are developed, which I'll show you in a moment, you kind of lay out the actions in a linear format going down the page. So having this Excel tool is very helpful. You really can translate one-to-one after you've documented here. But we show things here about setting something called a stage status message to users, where we might have approvals, if it is approved or rejected, which stage should it go, where emails are, etc. It all goes into this document. And the very last step of your design is changes that go into that, and really more so, there's a lot of testing that goes into that. So if you can get your design as close to perfect before you get into the tool and start, it'll save you a lot of time. And just another note here that if workflows are already running and in process and you make a change, a lot of times those changes require you to restart all the projects. You can restart them back to their current stage, but restarting workflows causes them to lose their history, so it essentially looks as if they entered workflow on the day you restarted. So a long way of saying try to get the design confirmed before you start developing. Okay, well, let's take a quick demo here and look at our workflow toolkit that I've been mentioning. I have it here on my desktop. So the first document, of course, was the Visio. This Visio is translated from the whiteboarding. You can see this uses swim lanes. And then the document I also mentioned was this detailed configuration. So the first tab is the phases and stages. Next, we list those phases and stages across the top here to identify where we're going to have fields that are required, available, or you can see I can also change something here to read-only. There's a read-only. Third tab is going to define those project detail pages. I'm going slow here just to make sure the voice catches up. Define project detail pages and where they appear in the workflow. Lastly, workflow actions, and this is the most detailed of any one of the worksheets in this toolkit. Here we define exactly all the steps that occur in the workflow. Okay, we're ready to go to step 2 now, which is configuring, not workflows, but configuring the project web app. So there are quite a large number of configurations for workflows. I've said this before, I often consider workflow configuration in the project web app to be the final exam, and that is because you're going to be building, creating what are called enterprise project types. These are types of projects. Underneath those, you're going to have your phases. Underneath phases, you're going to have stages. Stages are going to allow you to present project detail pages. And then on the project detail pages, you use web parts, one web part and specifically to display project fields, and last you have your project fields on those. So, given again just an hour to review workflows here, this is one area where I'm not going in detail. So certainly, once you're up to speed on all these concepts in the project web app, you'll be ready to configure them for workflow. So when we do our configuration, we're going to use our toolkit document to define in the project web app what are our phases, what are our stages, what project detail pages we have, what are the custom fields. And so I've highlighted those 4-5 items here on the PWA settings page. So let me show you this, again, not a detailed demo, but give you a high-level picture of the type of configurations you'll be making. So I'll move now to my project web app. And this is the home page of our Project Online environment. And from here, you're going to want to go to your Project Web App settings page. This is the page that administrators would have full access to. And let's talk about the configurations in a very abbreviated form. The first thing you're going to want to set up is your enterprise project types. And notice these fit the types of projects you have in your organization. I won't open up the screen here, but you also see that you're able to associate a workflow. Now, we haven't built our workflow, so you might start by creating the enterprise project types before you create the workflow, and then once you have it available, you would come in and set. And notice how two of my 6 enterprise project types here do have workflows associated with them. Those ones are ready. So you'll create perhaps a new enterprise project type for this new workflow that you're going to be configuring in your environment. Next thing you would do is configure your workflow phases. This is probably the easiest configuration of all of them. Essentially just listing the phases. Now, because I have different project types, and those project types might have different phases, you'll actually see multiple sets of phases sometimes in here. One requirement in Project Online is that, in 2013, is that the phases have unique names. So sometimes you have to be a little creative there with your phases if you have different departments. And then underneath the phases is going to be your stages. And you can see them actually grouped by different phases here in the configuration. Let me show you this in detail because there are a lot of settings here. So inside, for example, one of your initial stages, which might be concept, you're going to really take a lot of that information from the toolkit and configure it here. You're going to have a stage description. You can have a description for what message appears when the user hits submit to move to the next stage. You're going to associate that stage with its parent phase. Every stage is going to have the ability to show a workflow status page. And this is where users would click and see the status of the workflow. Now, you might have several different project detail pages. These are the form pages that present things like fields and the schedule and the strategic impacts. You're able to configure by stage which project detail pages, which form pages appear. Then you're able to make some very detailed settings here around which fields are either required, meaning that users can't advance beyond this stage unless they complete one of these fields, or which fields are going to be read-only. So at a high level, those are the configurations that go into stages. And of course, I didn't mention this, but over here in the upper right would be, or right in the middle center, I should say, is the ability to create your custom fields. So if you have certain fields you're going to collect, that would be done there. And then really the last piece of configuration would be these form pages. For example, I have one here called project details. And here I'm going to define on this project detail page which fields appear. You can break them up into different web parts if you want to have different sections, things like that. So that was a really abbreviated just guide at where you're going to find these areas to configure in your project web app. And for the sake of time, I'm going to move forward into more details on workflow. So we have everything in our project web app configured, and we're ready now to begin building our workflow. So as mentioned, you're going to launch SharePoint Designer 2013 as a recommendation and create a new workflow with the platform type of Project Server 2013, SharePoint 2013 Workflow Project Server. If you try to create one of the SharePoint-only workflows, those are not going to work. And this, by the way, is also a site workflow. Site workflow with the type of Project Server. And as I will demo in a moment, when you begin creating a workflow, it's essentially a blank canvas, and one of the first steps you want to do is add your stages in sequence. So the design, this has a linear design. It's going to flow from stage to stage. Well, it actually doesn't have to necessarily flow the same way it's laid out, but it's helpful to do that in your diagram. So you're going to insert your stages. And then inside each of the stages, there's really two halves of the stage. There's the top section for the actions that take place during the stage, and then there's the lower section of the stage that defines the transition to another stage. And so the essential building techniques are to insert actions in a stage and then insert a transition. So some of the common actions that you will have, there's really dozens of actions, if not more than 100. These are 5 of the more common ones that you would find in workflows. One of them is what's called wait when a project is submitted. So here, you're going to wait for the users to click the submit button in the project web app on their project before it moves to the next stage. And this is a pretty commonly used feature to allow the project owners to decide when they want to progress from stage to stage. They're clicking that submit button. But if you have alternative ideas, you can wait, of course, until the project is checked in or published, or when the summary information is published. By the way, these two lower options here, published and summary information published, I believe those are only available on Project Online or possibly Project Server 2003 on-premise with a recent public update. So that's one of the common actions. Another one might be what's called setting the stage status. This sets information on the workflow status page. Think of it as sending the project owner or the users essentially a message to inform them where the project is in the workflow. You can put specific information like, hey, we're waiting for you to fill out fields, or we're waiting for so-and-so to approve the project. It populates that area of the workflow status to let them know what's going on with the project. Going over to the second column here, 3 other actions that are common. One is starting what's called a task process. So we'd use this for approvals. So the workflow allows you to design an approval task. You can define who it goes to, if it requires a single user to approve or multiple, if they can approve in parallel or one by one. The fourth Common action would be emailing, real simple. You just put an email action in there, define who receives the email and what's in it. And then lastly, inside the workflow, you're able to work with variables. So maybe you want to read project information and set a variable as to maybe the budget for the project. If the budget's under a certain amount, there's no approval required. If it's over, there is approval. So that would be one example of how you'd use a variable in your workflow. Good, so let's demo just these few basic steps in creating our workflow. So I'll go back to SharePoint Designer, and I'll call this Virtual Project Conference Sample Workflow. So as I mentioned, when you first create a new project site workflow, it's going to have a blank canvas. And here on the workflow ribbon in the insert area, you're going to find it's going to actually go out and read your project web app. It's taking a while to do that. And provide me a list of stages that I've already configured. So this would be one reason why you need to configure the project web app before you get in and design workflows. So I'm just going to pick a few of these to kind of illustrate how it works. So we start with concept, and then after concept we're going to go to business case, and after business case we'll go to selection, and then let's just kind of shortcut this and go all the way to completed. So stages would be laid out in this canvas, and then I mentioned there are different actions. Now to insert an action, you want to click above the line here, and you can do it two ways. You can either pull down the menu and look at the dozens of actions, or once you get a little more familiar with the tool, you can actually start typing, kind of type ahead to find one of these actions. So let's say, for example, I want to email someone here. I can type email, and it will give me just the actions that have EM in them. So I can email users there. Then here in the transition, I want to say, what happens when I complete stage 1? I'm going to type go, see my go to stage. I'm going to go to stage business case. So this allows you to transition from one stage to the next. And to show you another shortcut here, you can actually copy actions, paste them into areas, and then I'll say, okay, great, from 1.2 I want to go to 1.3, from 1.3 I want to go to completed, and then the way you indicate a workflow as completed is you put end of workflow. Okay, so one of the tips I'll give you is that if I actually published and ran this workflow, the project would start in concept, it would send an email, then it would go business case, selection, completed, and it would be finished. So if you intend for a workflow to wait at one of these stages, you can do it a couple different ways. One way would be to require that users fill out fields, so that will stop at a certain stage if there's required fields that haven't been filled out. Another thing you can do is insert a wait action. And we're going to wait for what's called a project event, and I showed you these. Again, a common one being waiting for when a project is submitted. So project owners, editors would have to open the project in the project web app and click the submit button on the ribbon to move, in this case, from business case to selection. So this shows you kind of the basics of creating a new workflow by adding stages, filling out your actions, filling out the transitions. So we covered the basics, and now we're going to kind of swim to the deep end, if you will, and get a little more detailed. And I'm actually going to give you here in the next, looks like 15 minutes, 10 tips for configuring workflows, all kind of best practices that we've developed over years of developing these workflows. Now, the first one I already pointed out when I was developing my workflow is that a stage will automatically transition if there's no wait action. So if you're running your workflows and you say, hey, why didn't this stop at 1.1 concept? Well, the reason was there was no wait action. So make sure you put those wait actions in to stop at a stage. Next, there's really a great feature in the product. It's a feature for administrators, and this is, I use this really at every customer, so I think it's a very common feature, which is allowing administrators to skip projects to certain stages in the workflow. And there's surprisingly a design technique you need to use to enable the skipping. So let me actually show you. Let's see, I have a demo to show you this. So if I'm over here in my project web app, and I go to my PWA settings, I'll see a certain setting here for change or restart workflows. And what I can actually do is select a number of projects in my workflow. Let's say I want to take all 4 projects here in execution and move them to another stage, for example, canceled. So I want to cancel these 4 projects. So what I can do is select those projects, indicate that I want to move them to cancel, and click OK. And what the intent of this feature is, allow you to move, in this case, a bundle of projects in the workflow. However, surprisingly, this does not work out of the box. So you have to specifically design the ability to skip stages, to move projects in bulk to stages into your workflow. And the way this is done is in every action area, you need to include a condition called include this stage. And that condition has actually quite a bit of text. It says, if Project Web App starts the workflow normally or restarts the workflow and includes this stage. So you would think this would be a built-in feature, but it's not. So what you need to do is put this, I call it a wrapper, in every action area of every stage to allow skipping. So I've put that wrapper in. Now I would want to put my email step in here. See how that works? And in fact, when I'm developing workflows, a lot of times I'll take this wrapper and I'll just copy it and I'll put it in every single stage. And I make sure that all actions I develop in the stage, this is a really important tip, fall within this wrapper. That will allow you to skip successfully. And I have this also in the PowerPoint. So if you plan, and I pretty much guarantee you'll need to use this feature at one point, if you plan to skip projects in workflow, you've got to make sure that you put that if Project Web App starts the workflow normally or restarts the workflow and includes this stage, you must put that condition in every stage. Otherwise, it won't skip past the stage. Okay? Good, I already showed the demo on that. Another tip here, I think I'm on to the 3rd tip, which is transitioning to the end of a workflow at the end. So you saw me do this when I developed, but in your very last stage, you need a transition to end of workflow. In fact, if you forget this and you try to publish your workflow, it will give you an error message and it'll let you know that you're missing a transition. So you might wonder, well, how do I transition? It's the last stage. The answer is the very last stage needs to transition to the end of workflow. This tells SharePoint and the Project Web App that the workflow has been completed. Now, one of the common requests we'll get from customers is how do we configure cancel stages? So there's a couple different ways you can do this. The one that we found that works best is to put those cancel stages at the end. And through a series of testing, we actually figured out that if you put those cancel stages at the end of your workflow, you need one of these conditions, that same condition we were just talking about, if the Project Web App starts. You need to put that actually in your transition section. And notice how when I have a canceled stage, I have 2 end of workflows. So either a project can reach completed here and reach the end of a workflow, or a project might get transitioned into the canceled and also reach the end of the workflow. So there's two cases they reach the end. Either they're completed or canceled. And again, this is kind of a summarized version of our lesson learned, putting cancel stages at the end, having two end of workflows, or maybe you have more if you have an on hold in addition to a canceled, something like that. And this is what it looks like to design that. Okay, another common need is the ability to set project fields. And there's to set a project field in the workflow, you need to make sure the project is checked in. So the workflow is not able to modify any of your project fields if the project is checked out. So there's two ways to do that. The first way I show at the top here is within the stage configuration in the project web app, you can set an option called check-in is required. So if you go into that stage configuration, you'll see it at the bottom. What this does is when a project first moves into that stage, maybe my stage is completed, it will force check it in and allow the workflow to set a field right at the beginning of that stage. So that's a great technique if you want the field to be set right at the beginning of the stage. Use the check-in option, set the field. Alternatively, inside your workflow, you can wait for a check-in event. So just wait for the user to naturally check in the event in the project, then you can set a field. So either option will work for you. Either put the wait in your workflow action or check the option in stage setup. Another common question we've had is how do you send email from workflow? And this probably of all actions, this is the one we've struggled with the most. It just seems going customer from customer, it works different in every environment. So some of the best practices we found, if you're sending emails to the project owner, noticed in the project data, you're able to get the project owner email. Use that. Don't try to use the project owner name, which is another field that's available. So use the project owner email when you're sending to them. A lot of times you'll want to pull information from a project field. So let's say I have a project field configured called project sponsor. The best thing to do with that would be possibly to set it as a lookup field and make sure your lookup values match exactly to Exchange, last name, colon first name, or whatever is the typical Exchange standard to be able to find their email. And in some cases where we really have had trouble with like a project sponsor like this pulling from a value, what we'll do is we'll set up a SharePoint list in the background, and you can actually set up a list that has values like the requesters and then an email for each one of those. And then inside the workflow, you can take a value from your project data like project sponsor, match it to the list that's in the background, and then get the get the email from that list. So I know this requires a little maintenance that someone in the background has to maintain this list of emails, but it'll ensure the workflows don't crash, which is important. Okay, next tip is sometimes when you have these approval actions, approval tasks, the requirement will be you want to send an email in addition to either moving the project. So in this case, if the project is approved, I want to move it to selection. If it's rejected, I want to move it back to business case. Well, if the requirement is to send an email, notice I'm going to have two condition sets. I'm going to have one up here just to determine which email I send. So if it's approved, I send this approval email. If it's rejected, I send this rejected email. And then in the transition, I have kind of a similar condition set where I'm evaluating which stage to move it to. So the lesson learned is you can't really do this in one step, so you need to put it in twice. Once to determine which email to send, second time to determine where the project moves in workflow. Next tip. Some of you may be aware that there is a feature in the product called Portfolio Analysis, where you're able to select your projects based on their value to the organization. You're able to use either cost or resource constraints. So when you configure that in workflow, I have an example here. Projects in Portfolio Analysis will either be committed or they may be forced in, or they could be forced out. And from this TechNet article, I show you values that you can read from projects. So if you're using portfolio analysis and a project is forced in, it's going to have a value of 0. If it's naturally in, meaning it's just naturally selected, it's going to have a value of 3. So depending on whether or not you're using the cost analysis or the resource-based analysis, here are the different value sets. And if you want to just make sure if a project's selected in any one of those 4 cases, it moves forward, this is what your workflow configuration would look like. So have a look at this TechNet article. Have a look at my example action here to give you some ideas how to use portfolio analysis. Another thing we recommend is exporting your workflows to Visio for backup. So up on the ribbon of the SharePoint Designer, you'll see under Manage, Export to Visio. So we commonly do this before we make any change to the workflow. This takes and essentially exports a backup to us. And then when you're importing, we have found sometimes you'll get these cases where you're re-importing from Visio and there'll be a broken link in the workflow, and you actually need to fix that link in Visio before you can get back to what's called the text-based designer. So use Visio for backup. If you have to import from backup, note the need to reconnect certain stages sometimes. So I know that was a lot of detailed information, but we got through 10 tips and best practices, kind of all different cases we've experienced in a short order here. Let me talk next about some of the new workflow building actions. There's 2 of these. One of them is bulk update. And before you had this ability to do bulk updates, you had to do 1 field at a time. So a user would essentially be waiting for you to update 5 fields. Each one to get checked out, set, publish, checked out, set, publish. What this new action allows you to do is update multiple fields at once. Now it looks a little complicated here, but when you get into the design, this is a sample from TechNet, or actually MSDN, and I've highlighted, I've highlighted gray some of the actions here that are really optional. So if you're performing one of these field updates, you really just need the ones that aren't shaded here. And I won't go into detail, but when I actually tested this MSDN article, it seems like there's an error in one of the string builder images they have, so I did not have an extra slash in my string builder to make it work. So good. For the sake of time, I won't go into this in detail. Second one you have is the ability to create a project site. So this is one I mentioned earlier for performance. You can choose in your workflow when to create that project site. So the general setup is you want to allow users to choose when their project site's created. And then here are the steps in your workflow that you'll use, at least these 4 steps here, to create a project site at a certain stage or point in your workflow. And when that project site's created, it's going to go into the default location, and it's going to use the default, it's going to use the site template that you defined. Good, so we made it through our details of building. So our last step is just publishing and testing. So the publish is found on the upper left of the workflow design. You'll publish. There's also a check for errors, but I found that when you publish, it also checks for errors, so it'll do that for you. Now, it's really important in your testing that you go through and kind of create a detailed test plan, because every time you have a condition result, an approval, you want to make sure you test the rejection and test the approval. Test both sides of that. So you want to test, repeatedly going through workflows, each of the cases. Another thing you want to test is that skip to stage. Don't forget to test that. Sometimes we'll have customers that will deploy a workflow, they've tested it, but then when they start to try to skip, they discover problems. So as you're testing, some quick troubleshooting tips. When you're looking at the workflow status page, if something goes wrong in your workflow, you can click, it's kind of hard to find on the workflow status page. It's the bottom right. There's a little link for additional workflow details, and that will show you this page, additional workflow details. You want to look at what's called the internal status of the workflow, and if it's suspended or canceled or terminated. you can highlight that little information icon and it'll give you details of the error. Now when you're working with Project Online, this is one of the only ways you have for feedback because you can't go into event logs or things like that. So in addition to that, I mentioned in this slide that you can create what are called log activities. So you can actually log to the workflow history where you're at in your workflow. If you include a lot of these logging steps, you'll see them here in the workflow history. And that'll help you kind of pinpoint what are your variables, what email are you trying to send, things like that to help you troubleshoot. Well, good. We made it through our 4 stages right on time. So with that, Andrew, why don't we open it up now for questions?
All right, I don't have any questions now, but if anyone's got any questions, the discussion board on the right side of the project virtual conference page, we can answer this for you as well.
All right, I'll just share here and wait for questions to come in. Wait another minute, and then I'll talk about some ways you can get some more resources for workflows.
You can feel free to continue if you'd like, Scott.
Okay, so let me talk about some resources here. So there's a great white paper out on Microsoft published by Stephen Hayden, and that's really that's a great one. Stephen also did a session at Project Conference that's available. There's actually 2 sessions there available on Channel 9, which is a Microsoft site that shows a lot of their recorded content. So those are 2 additional sessions, webcasts, if you want to see them. And lastly, if you're an MPUG member, I did a, I think it was a 2-part, 6-hour in total series on building workflows. So a lot more details than we're able to cover in this hour available for Microsoft Project User Group members. So as mentioned at the onset, if you would like to get a hold of our workflow toolkit that has the Excel sheet and actually not shown here, but it shows some, it has a workflow building worksheets. Just email us at info@ppmworks.com for a copy of that toolkit. Another thing we do is what are called customer immersion experiences. This is a Microsoft-sponsored demo. It's going to take you across the project portfolio management solution through a number of devices. This is a really high-end demo. So if you are thinking about either implementing workflows in your organization or just adopting Project Online, Office 365 in general, we're happy to provide this, again, a high-end demo for you. We provide it either on-site or it can be in a local Microsoft office, whatever you prefer. So let us know. So the email there to get in contact us for the customer immersion experience is cie@ppmworks.com. So with that, I will thank you for your time. Thank you, Andrew, for moderating. And let me know if there are any questions. You can reach me at scott.clausen@ppmworks.com.
All right. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Have a good day.
Great. Have a good day, everyone.